The desert stretched endlessly, a land of silence where every gust of wind carried stories of battles long forgotten and love that had never been spoken. In this wilderness, a man sat alone by the faint glow of a fire. His name was Harlan Tate, a figure carved by the harshness of time, his face lined with scars, his hands calloused by years of survival. To most, he was just another shadow in a barren land. Yet that night, something shifted. The air grew still, as though holding its breath, waiting for a story to begin. Harlan had lived too long with only the rhythm of his own heartbeat for company. The river near his camp whispered faintly under the winter sky, its voice thin but insistent, like a reminder that life continued even in forgotten places. He leaned forward, stirring the fire with quiet motions, unaware that fate was guiding his eyes toward the place where loneliness would finally meet its mirror. There, across the bend of the river, a figure appeared, a delicate silhouette, moving with unhurried grace. The flicker of moonlight caught the strands of her wet hair, clinging to her skin like black silk. Her presence was not loud, not demanding, yet it pierced the stillness of the land with an intensity that pulled him out of his solitude. For the first time in years, Harlan felt his chest tighten, not from hunger, not from the ache of old wounds, but from something unfamiliar. A stirring of life, a call to look closer. He froze, breath caught, as though the earth itself had willed him to see her. She was not a dream, though the way her shoulders gleamed in the pale light made her seem more spirit than flesh. In that instant, the silence was no longer empty. It was alive, trembling with the unspoken promise that two wandering souls were about to collide. The warmth of the fire touched his hands, but it was her presence that began to thaw the cold he carried within. There is a strange healing that comes when one heart unknowingly reaches for another, even across distance. Harlan had not asked for it, had not dared to hope for it, yet here it was, a moment that cracked open the walls he had built around himself. And as you read these words, pause for a breath. Let the stillness soothe you. Let it remind you that even in the most barren stretches of life, beauty can appear without warning. If this story stirs something within you, if it makes you feel the quiet magic of connection, I invite you to leave a trace of your heart here. A like, a comment, a simple gesture that says, "I feel this too." In sharing that, you help keep the fire of stories alive, and together we walk a little less alone. The night deepened, the stars gleamed harder against the velvet sky, and Harlan knew that his life had just shifted, even if he did not yet understand why. He lowered his gaze, his breath steady but uneven in his chest. Something inside whispered that the path ahead would no longer be shaped by silence alone. The river would carry more than water now. It would carry her shadow, her breath, her unspoken story into his. The desert waited. And so did he. The night pressed close around the river, heavy with frost, and the faint smell of cedar smoke drifting from the small fire Harlan had built. He moved with slow, deliberate care, filling his tin cup with water, each motion quiet, as though he feared the silence might shatter if he wasn't gentle. Yet his eyes, though wary, were drawn again and again to the figure in the shallows. She did not flinch under his gaze. Her hair clung to her shoulders like ink spilled across her skin, and her dress, torn, damp, fragile in its wear, revealed just enough of her strength to remind him she was no apparition. A real woman, standing in a world that had long forgotten mercy. She looked younger than the weight in her eyes, as though her spirit had been forced to carry years her body had not yet lived. When their eyes locked, time felt altered. The crackle of fire, the rustle of dried grass, the distant call of coyotes, all faded into nothing. What remained was the thrum of his heartbeat, a sound too loud in his ears, and the calm steadiness in her gaze that spoke of battles endured, choices made, and exile accepted. He shifted a step back, not out of fear, but in a wordless offering of space. "Just water." His voice rasped low, roughened by disuse, carried not as a warning, but as a fragile truth. She said nothing. Her chin lifted slightly, a gesture of quiet defiance, or perhaps of recognition. He had seen warriors look at death that way, yet in her, it was not death she faced, but him. And still, she did not run. Harlan filled his cup, turned toward the fire, and walked back to camp with the steady patience of a man who had lived too long in shadows. Yet before the embers, before the soft glow of warmth, he heard it, the sound of bare feet brushing against brittle earth. She had followed, not as a captive, not as prey, but as someone who chose to step into his circle of flame and smoke. She lingered at the edge, her presence fragile as the first light of dawn. He reached for a second cup, rinsed it, and held it out without ceremony. She accepted, though she did not drink. Her silence was its own language, and he listened without interruption. The firelight danced across her face, revealing bruises and small cuts like maps of pain, and yet her back remained straight, her eyes unyielding. "Rest here tonight," he said simply. It was neither command nor plea, only an opening. She did not answer. But when he spread a blanket opposite his own, she lowered herself upon it with the grace of someone who had walked through storms and finally allowed herself to pause. That night, Harlan did not sleep. He watched the fire dim and brighten, his thoughts tangled in the quiet rhythm of her breathing. He had not shared his fire in years. To wake and hear another soul draw breath beside him was like remembering a song he had forgotten, one that healed even as it hurt. At dawn, he found her kneeling by the flames, mending her torn dress with fingers that moved as though they had never been given gentleness. The neckline dipped lower as she bent forward, and he averted his gaze, not from shame, but from respect, unwilling to take what had not been freely offered. When he looked back, her eyes were on him, calm and unreadable. And then the first word, soft, gravelly, rough with silence, long endured. T. Her name. A seed of trust placed in his keeping. He gave his own in return. Harlan. Nothing more was needed. In that exchange, a bridge was built, fragile yet unbreakable in its honesty. The hours that followed unfolded with an ease that surprised him. She gathered wood. He cleaned his rifle. She patched leather with bone and sinew. He sharpened blades dulled by years of solitude. No bargains were struck, no promises spoken, yet everything between them said they would face the day together. The desert no longer seemed as barren, the air no longer as harsh. Healing in its quiet form had begun. By midday, he saw the hunger in her movements, the way she chewed slowly, saving the taste as though food was something rare. Without a word, He snared rabbits along the ridge and laid them out upon stones, while she seasoned them with desert sage she carried in a small bundle. Side by side they ate, and side by side they learned that silence need not mean loneliness. As dusk bled into the valley, Harlan studied her while she sat across the fire. The scars on her skin spoke of exile. Her totem burned in the flames spoke of rebellion, and the steady set of her jaw spoke of survival. He saw in her what he had long hidden in himself, the refusal to yield to a world that demanded obedience. Later, when she lay down beneath the spare blanket he had offered, she reached her hand subtly behind her, leaving it open near the edge of where he sat. Not a request, not an invitation, only a quiet declaration: "I am here. I stay." For the first time in years, Harlan let the fire's glow soothe him rather than guard him. For the first time since the war, he allowed hope, a fragile, dangerous thing, to settle in his chest. And so the night deepened, wrapping them in its stillness. The desert stretched on, but its silence was no longer empty. Somewhere beyond the stars, fate had set two broken paths upon one crossing, and as sleep took her and wakefulness kept him, Harlan knew he would not be the same man when dawn returned. The river whispered, the fire sighed low, and a story of love, slow, unhurried, healing, had begun to unfold. Morning broke with a pale wash of light spilling across the ridge, the kind of dawn that carried no warmth, only the fragile promise of another day survived. Harlan rose before the sun crested the hills, his body long accustomed to vigilance, his senses sharper in silence than most men's in battle. The fire was little more than ash, but beside it T still slept, her knees tucked beneath the blanket he had given her, her breathing even, her face turned toward the fading embers. He watched her in stillness, the sight stirring something he had not felt in years, a kind of gentleness that did not weaken him, but steadied him. He left her undisturbed, moving quietly along the edge of the river. The water was low, slow, yet its sound soothed like a whispered prayer. He filled the canteen, washed his hands in the icy current, and thought of the word she had given him the night before. Her name, T. It lingered on his tongue even when unspoken, a fragile thread of connection. He had learned in war that names were everything. To know someone's name was to acknowledge their existence beyond survival, and now, in this desolate valley, hers was the first name that mattered to him in years. When he returned, she was awake. She sat by the fire pit, mending the seam of her dress with a strip of sinew he had provided. Her hair fell forward, half shadowing her face, but her eyes lifted to meet his as he set the canteen down. No words passed, yet in that gaze was an unspoken acceptance. He had gone, and he had returned. Such small things meant survival. Such small things became trust. They shared a meal in silence, the roasted rabbit from the day before, and coarse ground corn. She portioned her share carefully, not greedily, offering him half, though she clearly hungered. He shook his head, pushing it back toward her, but she only pressed it to the ground between them, a refusal to take more than he did. In her discipline he saw strength, and in her strength he found respect. By midday the cold grew sharper, the wind sliding down from the mountains like a blade. Harlan gathered wood while T worked at the leather of her dress, rethreading beads she had salvaged, her fingers quick though raw from the cold. It was the first time he saw her make something not out of necessity, but out of memory. Each bead she pressed into the leather was a quiet defiance, a refusal to let the past erase her. He watched her from the corner of his eye, recognizing the healing power of creation, how it stitched spirit as surely as it stitched cloth. Later, when she moved to the river to wash, he did not follow. Instead, he sat near the fire, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes, listening to the water carry her presence back to him. When she returned, strands of her hair damp, her skin glistening faintly in the afternoon sun, he looked up and caught a glimpse of the woman beyond exile. Not just the survivor, not just the outcast, but the human being who had carried herself through storms and refused to bow. She met his gaze briefly, then lowered herself beside the fire, her shoulder nearly brushing his, though she left the distance intact. The hours of the day folded into evening, and with it came a rhythm neither of them had sought, but both had accepted. She gathered branches, he set the traps. She tied the canvas tighter against the wind, he split kindling. Each act was small, ordinary, yet together they carried the weight of something greater: companionship. For two souls who had long lived alone, the simple sharing of tasks was as intimate as a touch. When darkness fell, they ate again, quieter than before, the fire's glow painting their faces in shades of amber. Harlan felt the question rise in his chest, heavy and unbidden. Why had she stayed? But he did not speak it. Instead, he let silence carry the answer in her nearness, in the way she did not retreat into shadows, but sat within his circle of flame. That night, she did not reach her hand toward him as she had before. Instead, as she lay wrapped in the blanket, she let her back rest just a little closer to his bedroll, close enough that he could feel her warmth seeping faintly across the space between. He did not move toward her, but he did not pull away either. It was enough to know she had chosen that nearness, enough to let him breathe a little deeper, enough to heal something hollow inside him. Sleep came slowly. He kept his rifle within reach, his body alert even as his mind softened. Across the fire, her breathing steadied, her shoulders rising and falling in a rhythm that calmed the restless places inside him. He turned onto his side, his eyes fixed on the dim curve of her silhouette, and thought, not of war, not of loneliness, but of possibility. The desert outside remained the same, harsh, cold, indifferent. But within their circle of firelight, something had shifted. A bond, fragile as dawn, had begun to form. And in its warmth, Harlan realized that survival was no longer enough. When morning came, the wind had softened, and the land seemed less cruel. T rose early, braiding her hair with slow, practiced motions, while Harlan rekindled the fire. Their eyes met once more, and though not a word was spoken, both felt the truth settle between them. They were no longer alone, and whatever road stretched ahead, it would not be walked in solitude. The river whispered again, carrying its healing song through the valley, a song of endurance, of trust, of the fragile beginnings of love. The third dawn came with frost dusting the canvas and earth, a thin white sheen that glimmered faintly in the rising sun. Harlan stirred before first light, his body tuned to the hours of soldiers and scouts, the kind of man who never let the world wake before he did. He rose quietly, pulling his coat around his shoulders, the Henry rifle slung low in habit more than fear. The fire had burned to embers, but the soft rhythm of T's breathing behind the windbreak reassured him more than flames ever could. He moved along the ridge above the river, scanning for signs. Rabbits, quail, the faint crossing of deer. It wasn't hunger alone that drove him now. It was the knowledge that there was someone else to feed, someone who had placed her trust in his circle of firelight. That simple truth steadied him, made each step purposeful. When he returned with 2 rabbits in his burlap sack, smoke was already curling thin from the fire pit. T was crouched there, stoking the embers with careful hands, her hair falling loose across her shoulders. She looked up when he appeared, and for the first time he saw it. The faintest flicker of a smile, gone as quickly as it came, but real enough to leave its warmth in him. He crouched beside her, laying the rabbits down. She glanced at them, then back at him, and her silence was no longer distant. It was something shared. They cleaned and cooked together, her movements precise, his steady, the rhythm of 2 people who needed no instruction to fall into step. She offered him desert sage from her small bundle, and when he used it to season the meat, he felt the gesture like a thread binding them closer. They ate slowly, neither thanking the other, for it was not charity but necessity, carried together. When the meal was finished, she reached into the fold of her dress and pulled free a small carved figure of wood, worn smooth with age. She held it in her palm a moment, then without hesitation dropped it into the flames. Harlan watched as the fire consumed it, the carved lines blackening, cracking, until it collapsed into ash. Her face did not waver. Only when she spoke did he understand. "I said no." The words were gravel, low and rough, but they carried the weight of exile. He understood enough. Some elder, some arrangement, a life she refused. She had chosen her freedom over obedience, and the price had been banishment. He did not ask for more, because in her steady eyes he saw that the story had already been told in full. That night, as the fire dimmed, he unrolled another blanket and laid it beside her windbreak. She glanced at him long, her expression unreadable, then drew the blanket around her shoulders. When she lay down, her hand slipped back, resting open at the edge of the space between them, not reaching, not demanding, only a quiet offering of presence. He did not take it, but he did not move away either. That was enough. The 4th day dawned colder still, a storm pressing down from the north, the kind of cold that clung to the bones and never truly lifted. Harlan felt it in the air, the heaviness of weather he had known from years of marching through unforgiving lands. He thought of moving on, of searching for shelter deeper in the canyon. But when he glanced at T, bent over her dress, sewing beads with slow care, he realized they had already chosen. They were no longer drifting, they were staying. Her presence changed the way he looked at the world. Where once he had seen only survival, he now noticed the way she portioned her food with thought for tomorrow, the way she braided her hair, not just to keep it neat, but to hold on to something of herself. She carried scars, yes, but also a kind of discipline that was its own healing. Watching her, he began to understand that silence did not mean emptiness. It could mean strength, a strength that had outlasted exile. As the days bled together, they began to move as one. She gathered firewood without being asked, her arms laden with sticks. He mended the tent flap with old canvas and thread. She scraped bark from the logs to keep the fire clean. He taught her to tie a knot that would hold against wind. These were not grand acts, not words of love, yet they carried intimacy deeper than touch. To share labor, to trust another with survival, was to admit dependence, and dependence was the first step to belonging. That evening, when she returned from the river with her hair wet, she did not braid it, but let it hang loose in the fading light. He saw the scar on her shoulder, pale and thin, and his eyes lingered longer than they should have. He expected her to turn away, to guard herself, but she did not. She sat beside the fire, closer than before, her knees brushing the edge of his blanket. That small closeness was more than touch. It was permission. Later, as night closed in, she unfastened the feather she kept in her hair and handed it to him. He held it, uncertain, until she gestured between the tent and the windbreak, then back to the feather. Not a gift, not a trade, but a declaration. I am not a burden. I am part of this now. He tucked the feather carefully into a notch above the tent flap, where the wind could not take it. She nodded once, and in that simple motion, the silence between them softened into something that felt like trust. That night, when the wind rose and the fire guttered low, they sat closer still. Their shoulders brushed beneath the blankets, and though no words were spoken, the weight of loneliness began to lift. Harlan listened not for threats, but for the steady rhythm of her breathing. T did not rest with her hand near her knife that night. For the first time she slept without fear, and for the first time in years he slept knowing someone had chosen to remain. In the morning, the world was unchanged, the desert still vast, the sky still cold, but within the circle of their fire, everything was different. They were no longer two shadows surviving apart. They were something bound together, fragile yet certain, beginning to heal in the quiet rhythm of shared days. The land might not forgive, the past might not relent, but beneath the stars and frost, two exiled hearts had found a place to rest. And in that simple, wordless bond, the first shape of love had begun to form. The cold settled deeper as the fifth day unfolded, the kind of steady chill that no fire fully chased away. Frost clung to the canvas seams, brittle grass snapped underfoot, and the river itself carried the bite of winter in its shallow current. Yet within the fragile circle of warmth they had built, there was a sense of steadiness, a rhythm of survival that was no longer only his or hers, but theirs. Harlan woke before the sun, as always, the habits of soldiering still etched into his bones. He eased from his blanket without sound, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon for shadows. But his eyes returned again and again to the small figure still curled beneath the spare covering, her breathing soft, her face softened by rest. T. Even in sleep she carried tension, her hands tucked close, her body ready to wake at the slightest shift. He knew that kind of vigilance, and it drew him to her all the more. He spent the morning high on the ridge, snaring rabbits and setting careful traps. The valley stretched wide and barren, but his thoughts never strayed far from the fire below. He remembered the way her hand had rested open near him nights before, the way she had pressed her feather into his keeping. Small gestures, perhaps, but to a man who had lived years with nothing but silence, they meant more than words. By midday, he returned to camp with his catch. T was there, stoking the fire, her hair loose and glinting in the pale light. She looked up, saw the rabbits, and her lips parted slightly. Not a smile, but something near it. He cleaned them slow, letting her watch, showing her the careful strokes of his knife, the way to preserve every bit of meat. She handed him desert sage again, and together they laid the pieces on hot stones. When they ate, their movements matched, each waiting for the other, each sharing without needing to ask. Later, as the sun dipped lower, she gathered sticks near the tree line while he sat sharpening his knife. He watched her, the way she moved with purpose, unafraid of the land around her. She carried scars, yet none of them bent her spirit. When she returned, dropping the wood neatly by the fire, she sat close, closer than she had before. Their shoulders brushed, and neither pulled away. That small warmth sank into him, a healing deeper than any medicine. When dusk came, she reached into her dress and unwrapped a small bundle, a carved totem, its face worn with time. Without a word, she tossed it into the fire. The flames licked at it, cracking it, reducing it to blackened ash. Her jaw tightened, but her eyes stayed steady. "I said no," she whispered again, the words like stone. Harlan did not question. He only nodded, understanding that her exile had been no accident but a choice, a defiance against a fate forced upon her. He respected her more for it. That night, the cold grew harsher. Tea trembled beneath the blanket, though she tried to hide it. Harlan sat watching, his jaw clenched, until at last he pulled his bedroll and laid it beside hers. She turned, her eyes meeting his, wary but unafraid. When he settled down, their shoulders nearly touched. Minutes passed, long and silent, before she shifted just enough that her back brushed his arm. Not an invitation, not surrender, only trust. He lay still, but his chest eased for the first time in years. Sleep came to her quickly. To him, it came slower. He listened to her breathing, steady now, her body no longer tensed against every sound. He realized she had not once reached for the knife tucked in her boot. For the first time, she trusted the night to pass in peace. He let his eyes close, the fire's glow warming more than his skin. The next morning brought change. The land itself felt different, the air too still, the birds absent. Harlan felt it in his gut before he saw it. He rose quietly, glass to his eye, scanning the valley. Riders. 3 figures, distant but certain, moving with purpose across the brush. He cursed under his breath and returned to camp. Tea had already risen, her blanket slung over her shoulder, her knife in hand. She read the answer in his face before he spoke. "They're tracking," he said low. She nodded once, calm, ready. They broke camp quickly, efficient as one. He left false trails, scattered footprints, led them through the shallow stream to mask their path. They moved south, the way she had once suggested, and though no words passed, both understood why. It was not just escape, it was defiance. By afternoon they rested in a gulch, backs against stone, their breaths slow but steady. Tea drank from the canteen, her hands trembling faintly, though not from fear. "They won't stop," she said, her voice quiet but resolved. He looked at her, saw the truth in her eyes, and gave the only answer that mattered. "Then we won't let them find you." That night they did not light a fire. They shared cold food, wrapped in one blanket stretched between them. The stars burned overhead, sharp and clear, and the silence between them was no longer heavy but united. She shifted the blanket, pulling part of it toward him, a gesture of inclusion. They leaned against the same stone, not touching fully, but close enough that the warmth of their bodies blended. Harlan lay awake long after she slept, her head tilted slightly toward his shoulder. The desert was wide and merciless, and the men hunting them were not far. But for the first time in his life, he did not feel like a man running. He felt like a man standing, a man choosing to stay, even if it meant danger. The fire might have been gone, the valley harsh and uncertain, but beside her he found something he had never carried through war, never found in solitude: belonging. And as dawn crept over the ridge, painting the sky with fragile color, he knew with certainty that whatever came, he would not walk alone again. The night passed without fire, only the pale wash of moonlight painting the canyon walls, and the sound of their breathing held close together beneath the blanket they shared. Harlan did not sleep much. Old habits never allowed him to. Yet, as he sat with his back against the stone, he found comfort in the weight of T's presence resting lightly against him, her warmth pressed near his shoulder. For years he had known only the cold emptiness of solitude, and now that space was filled by a quiet companionship that healed places in him he thought would never mend. When dawn broke, it came slow and grey, the air damp with frost. T stirred beside him, her hair falling across her face, and when she lifted her eyes to him, there was no fear, only steady resolve. He rose first, stretching the stiffness from his limbs, and offered her the canteen. She took it, sipped, and handed it back without a word. Their silence had become something else, no longer distance, but a thread binding them in unspoken understanding. They moved quickly through the narrow passes, careful to leave no trace. Harlan checked the ground often, scanning for signs of pursuit, but saw nothing fresh. Still, his instincts told him they were not yet free. T walked close behind him, her steps light, her eyes sharp, never faltering. She carried her knife openly now, not hidden, the blade a natural extension of her strength. Watching her stirred something inside him that was not just respect, but admiration. She was no fragile figure to be pitied. She was fire, banked beneath stillness, a flame that refused to die. By midday, they reached a stretch of high stone overlooking a basin. The land below lay wide and broken, scattered with shale and boulders. It would take hours to cross, and Harlan knew they would be exposed the entire way. He crouched low, raising the glass to his eye, scanning the horizon. At first, nothing. Then movement. 3 riders, distant but purposeful, cutting across the brush in a line too straight to be chance. He lowered the glass, his jaw tight. "They're coming," he murmured, more to himself than to her. T's expression did not change. She looked to the basin, then back to him, and her eyes held only clarity. "We stand," she said simply, her voice calm. Harlan studied her, the surety in her words, and found himself nodding. He had lived years running from orders, from people, from memories, but not now, not with her. They pulled back into the shelter of a boulder cluster, rifles and knives ready. The silence stretched, heavy with anticipation, until the first rider appeared at the basin's edge. A lean man in a long coat, rifle laid across his lap, scanning both sides as he rode. Behind him came 2 more, one with a carbine, the other leading a spare horse. Harlan's breath slowed, his finger resting along the trigger guard of the Henry. He could end it with a single shot. But when he lifted his eyes, T was already watching him. She reached out, touched his arm lightly, grounding him. The simple contact carried more weight than any words. "Don't lose yourself to the violence." He breathed in, steady, and fired. The first rider fell instantly, the crack of the shot echoing like thunder through the basin. Chaos followed, shouts, return fire, the horses wheeling. T moved like shadow, circling low through the rocks. When one of the men advanced, rifle raised, she rose and hurled her knife with perfect aim. The blade sank deep into his thigh, dropping him with a cry. Harlan fired again, striking the third through the shoulder. Silence fell, broken only by groans and the restless stamping of frightened horses. T retrieved her knife, wiping the blade clean against her boot. Her movements were calm, practiced, as though she had lived this before. When she returned to him, her eyes met his, unwavering. "You hesitated," she said, not as accusation but as truth. He nodded once, not denying it. She studied him a long moment, then spoke softly. "Good." That night they camped in a dry ravine. No fire lit, only the cold moon above. They sat side by side against the stone, their bodies tired, but their spirits unbroken. T cleaned her blade while Harlan wiped down the Henry, both quiet, both content in the knowledge that they had survived together. After a long silence, she looked at him and said, "You left the killing behind." "I tried," he answered. His voice was rough, yet softer than he intended. "But you still did it." He met her eyes. "Because you needed me to." She held his gaze, then nodded slowly, accepting. The night grew colder, and she shifted the blanket between them, spreading it across his shoulders as well. Their hands brushed beneath the fabric, and for the first time she did not pull away. Neither did he. They slept leaning against the same stone, her head resting lightly near his shoulder, his arm curved protectively without thought. The desert was vast and merciless, but within that small circle of closeness there was warmth, there was healing, and there was the beginning of something that felt like home. When morning came, the ravine lay silent, the sky washed pale with the first light. Harlan stirred, feeling the weight of her presence still near, and for once he did not rise immediately to check the horizon. He let the moment linger, let the quiet wrap around him like the blanket they shared. T shifted beside him, her eyes opening slowly, and when she looked at him, there was no guard in her expression, only a calm acceptance that said without words, "I am still here. I will stay." And for Harlan, who had spent years drifting through emptiness, that truth was enough to steady every broken place inside him. The road ahead would not be easy. The men hunting them might return. The land itself would test them. But for the first time since he had left the army, he knew he would not face it alone. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm neither of them had planned, yet both embraced. The ravine became their shelter, its stone walls holding back the wind, while the narrow sky above framed each dawn and dusk. Harlan reinforced the entrance with logs and brush, stacking stones carefully until the place resembled something more than a camp. It resembled a home. T gathered clay from the spring and shaped it into small pots, smoothing the surfaces with river stones, her hands patient and steady. These simple tasks, born of necessity, carried with them a sense of permanence neither dared to name, but both felt. Each morning Harlan walked the perimeter, his rifle resting across his arm, scanning for tracks. He found none, though his instincts never let him rest fully. Each evening T returned from the river with her hair damp, her steps light, And when she set down the pot of water beside the fire, her eyes always sought his. Their silence was no longer empty. It was woven with recognition. In every glance, in every shared gesture, a thread of connection deepened. The cold grew harsher. A storm rolling down from the northern ridge one afternoon, with a sky the color of copper. They pulled everything inside: wood, food, blankets, and sealed the entrance with brush. The wind howled outside, rattling against the stone, but within the cave they sat facing each other, their knees touching beneath the blanket. Harlan studied her, the way the firelight revealed the strength in her face, the quiet resilience in her eyes. "I never thought I'd come this far south and find anything worth staying for," he murmured, voice low, almost reluctant. T did not smile, but her gaze softened. "We didn't find it," she said gently. "We made it." Her words carried warmth that seeped into him, healing something raw inside. He reached out, almost hesitant, and when his hand brushed hers, she did not pull away. Instead, her fingers laced with his, firm and certain. That night, when the storm raged hardest, she leaned closer, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her without thought, his body shielding hers from the cold. She sighed, not weary but comforted, and for the first time in decades he allowed himself to rest with someone pressed close. Sleep came with ease, not as an enemy, but as a gift. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and clean. The land outside was scoured bare, but within the cave a fragile peace remained. They stepped out together, their breath rising in white clouds, and for a long moment simply stood side by side, watching the pale sun lift over the horizon. Harlan felt her hand slip into his, unforced, and the simple act made the barren valley glow with quiet promise. Days stretched into weeks. They built more than shelter. They built rhythm. T braided her hair each dusk, the feather he had kept for her tied once more into its strands. Harlan cleaned his rifle each morning, though less out of fear and more from habit, his mind no longer consumed by enemies, but by the thought of protecting what they were shaping together. They dried meat on a rack, stacked wood higher, and spoke in fragments that meant more than whole conversations. Her name on his tongue, his in hers, the few words they traded, carrying the weight of vows. At night, the fire burned low while they sat close, their shoulders brushing, their warmth shared. Sometimes she would lean into him, her head against his chest, and he would breathe her in, smoke, sage, river water, and something uniquely her. Other times he would reach for her hand, and she would answer with a squeeze, firm and steady, grounding him in the moment. These touches were not urgent, not desperate, but deliberate, like the slow weaving of a bond that was meant to endure. One evening, as the sky faded into dusk, T touched his jaw lightly, her thumb brushing the line of an old scar. Her eyes searched his face, not with pity, but with knowing. He did not speak, did not need to. He let her see all of it, the loneliness, the battles, the years of silence. And when she leaned forward to press her lips to his, it was slow, certain, healing. He kissed her back with the weight of a man who had forgotten tenderness but found it again in her. They pulled apart only when the fire popped, sparks lifting into the air. Their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling, hearts steady. In that stillness, Harlan understood that he was no longer a man waiting for departure, no longer a wanderer chasing distance. He had found something worth staying for, something worth building with his own hands. That night, they lay beneath the same blanket, no longer separated by space. Her body curved against his arm wrapped securely around her, and sleep came to them both in warmth. The world outside remained harsh, but within that small circle of closeness they had carved out a place of healing, a place where two broken souls could rest. When dawn arrived, painting the cave walls in gold, T stirred first, her hand resting lightly on his chest. He opened his eyes to find her watching him, her gaze steady, her expression soft. No words passed between them, yet the truth was clear. They had chosen this, chosen each other, chosen to face whatever lay ahead, not as wanderers, not as fugitives, but as two hearts bound together. The desert still whispered of danger, but in that moment it also sang of love, quiet, resilient, unyielding. And as they stepped into the day, side by side, their shadows stretched long across the barren earth, no longer solitary, but entwined. The cave had become more than shelter. It had become theirs. Each stone they stacked, each log they placed, each small ritual of living carved a rhythm that belonged not to survival alone, but to something gentler, deeper. Harlan no longer counted the days in silence. He counted them by the sound of T's footsteps returning with water, by the way her voice, still rough but steady, would murmur a word or two across the fire. She no longer carried herself as one waiting to be hunted. She moved as someone who had chosen to stay. Evenings softened them most. The desert, for all its cruelty, gave them sunsets of endless color, gold melting into crimson, shadows stretching like silk across the ridges. They would sit outside the cave as the light bled away, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm curved around her waist. The firelight would flicker, catching in her eyes, and for the first time since war and exile, both of them could simply be. The silence they shared was not emptiness now. It was peace. One evening, after a day of shaping clay jars and mending the canvas flap, T braided her hair by the fire. She slipped the feather into its strands, then reached across the small distance between them and pressed his hand with hers. "This is enough," she whispered, her voice carrying a healing weight. He looked at her, the fire's glow tracing the strength in her face, and nodded slowly. More than enough. The words came like a vow, unplanned but true. Nights grew warmer, not only from the fire, but from the closeness they allowed. At first, it was the brush of her leg against his, the shared blanket pulled tighter over both. Then it was her hand resting over his chest as she drifted into sleep, her breath steady against his skin. Harlan, once restless even in silence, now found himself sleeping deeply, guarded not by vigilance, but by her presence. Each dawn he woke with her beside him, and each dawn carried the quiet miracle that she remained. One morning, while he cleaned the rifle and she gathered wood, a mule wandered down from the ridge, lost, thin, but alive. Together they caught it, tied it near the spring. Harlan suggested trading it one day, but T shook her head softly. or we keep it." They did. Naming it was unnecessary. It was simply theirs, another piece of the life they were weaving. Time moved differently then. Weeks were no longer burdens, but threads woven into something whole. Harlan built a crude doorframe for the cave, reinforcing it with logs. T filled the clay jars with water and roots, arranging them neatly along the walls. Together they lined stones in a small circle just outside, a place not for defense, but for firelight meant to welcome. Each act was small, yet each was a promise. The love that grew between them was not sudden flame, but steady ember. It showed in the way she brushed ash from his coat, in the way he reached to tie her bundle tighter when they foraged. It was in the laughter that finally escaped her lips one afternoon when he stumbled clumsily over a root, and in the rare smile he gave in return. That sound, the music of her laughter, he carried with him like a treasure, healing scars he had long believed permanent. One night, under a sky thick with stars, she reached out and touched his face, tracing the line of an old scar along his jaw. He caught her hand, held it against his skin, and closed his eyes. "You see all of it," he said quietly. She leaned in, her lips brushing his, and when they kissed, it was not desperate but certain, the kind of kiss that anchors two souls in place. For Harlan, who had lived as a shadow, it was the moment he stepped fully back into life. For T, who had been cast away, it was the moment she was claimed not as belonging to someone, but as chosen, freely and wholly. The desert still carried its dangers, but the weight of fear lessened. When they heard coyotes at night, they did not stir. When the wind rose, they faced it together. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined them. What defined them now was the fire they shared, the bond they had chosen, the love that had taken root even in barren earth. Seasons would change, storms would come, but they had already found what mattered most, a home in each other. And in that truth lay the deepest healing of all. If this story touched something in your heart, if it brought you a breath of warmth, a reminder of love's quiet power, I invite you to let it linger with you. Leave a like, share your thoughts in a comment, and subscribe so you can journey with me through more tales that carry both fire and healing. Your presence here keeps the flame alive, and every gesture of support helps weave more stories of hope, love, and belonging.